From the Oklahoma newsroom, it is time for Thunder Thursday. I'm Jenny Collison here with part of our Thunder coverage team, columnist Barry Trammell, Thunder beat writer Brett Dawson. Guys, the offseason is fully upon us, but still stuff to talk about. And top of the list is the retirement of Mr. Thunder, Nick Collison. We had sort of guesstimated that this was coming, but last week, Brett, it became official that he said he was done after a 15-year career. Pretty remarkable, the impact he left on this franchise. And even though it was expected, I know a lot of people within the Thunder really going to miss having him as a player.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know that there are very many people who have ever played in the NBA who had extended careers, never averaged double figures in points or rebounds, and would have people talking about whether it was worth retiring their jersey number when they leave. Nick Collison has made an impact on the franchise that goes well beyond what he did on the court. Really was not a factor on the court in recent years. You know, in the time that I've been here, I mostly know Nick Collison as kind of a locker room bench presence guy. You know, people here who have been here a long time have seen him contribute to important wins, to playoff wins, but that's pretty far in his rearview mirror. And yet still he's been kind of a fixture. He's a guy that I think, especially in the days after Kevin Durant left, he and Russell Westbrook were kind of foundational guys, kind of helped keep the culture steady here in those days after Durant. So, yeah, a guy who really made an impact and was very kind to say goodbye with an ad in the Oklahoman, which we all appreciate.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick Collison. Barry, what will stand out for you? Because as Brett mentioned, you know, in the last couple years, Nick Collison really has become a veteran guy that we see on the bench, but not a lot more. But in years prior to that, we saw him play a fairly significant role for this team. What will you remember of his career?
Well, I'll remember back when he was a playing member of the rotation. You know, the last 3.5 years, he really hasn't been in the rotation. His last hurrah was during that injury-marred 14-15 season. Therefore, while in November, people forget, Nick Collison played a bunch of minutes at small forward. He even took a bunch of three-point shots. They were out of wing players. Nick Collison had to play outside. That was really his last hurrah. But before that, he was a valued member of this rotation, averaging 20-something minutes a game on those teams that went to the West Finals in 11 and 12 and 14. So Nick Collison was a really good player for a long time and was such a solid citizen that the Thunder kept him around even after that playing ability had subsided. But that's the sign of a quality guy is when you can play, they play you, and when you can't play, they want you around anyway.
Well, you know, Russell Westbrook's become known as Mr. Oklahoma. But Mr. Thunder, I mean, I don't think that's a title that anybody disputes it with Nick Collison. But Brett, you bring up an interesting point about his impact and whether we may one day see number 4, Collison, raised into the rafters of the peak. Is that something you think could realistically happen?
Well, I would say this. There are a lot of people who are in favor of it. So some local media people, in fact, are in favor of it. I would say there's 2 numbers that probably need to be retired before Nick Collison's, 2 numbers that are much more important. And one of those probably can't be retired for some time. Yeah. I mean, 35 is not going up there until sometime long after now. 0 is going up there someday. That's also going to be a while because there's still retirement for both those players. And for Kevin Durant, there may be some healing time that still has to happen. It's hard for me to imagine hanging Nick Collison's number before you put those other 2 guys up, but there's no question that he's had the kind of impact franchise-wise that at least makes that a discussion worth having.
Barry?
Now, I can see Nick Collison's number 4 going up before number 35. You know, the Thunder doesn't have many. They don't have many rocks to throw in this fight, but that's one they can throw, and I think that's one they will throw. So I think Kevin Durant's jersey will go up eventually. But I think it won't be second on the list. So, you know, I tend to think, you know, I think Russ is going to have a statue out front.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be a statue for Nick Collison. I do predict that his jersey goes up.
Guys, lastly on Nick Collison, what's the future hold for this guy? I mean, he's been in the league a long, long time. He got relocated with the franchise from Seattle, a place that he loves. He's got a daughter in the Kansas City area. He was not around when he announced his retirement because his girlfriend's graduating from Vanderbilt. You know, so a lot going on in his life. Brett, do we have a sense of what's next for him?
No, we don't, and I think what's next for him really depends on what he wants to be next. I mean, if he wanted to coach, I think the Thunder would probably give him a spot on the staff. They have had a spot open since Anthony Grant left. They didn't really feel like they needed to fill. If Nick Collison came to them and said, hey, I'd like that spot, I think there's a pretty good chance he could have it. If he came to Sam Presti and said, I'd like to work in the front office, I think there's a pretty good chance they'd create a job. If he wanted to be in broadcasting, they'd probably find some kind of option for him. I think he's got some options here if he wants them. The stuff he talked about, and he didn't have a press conference, obviously, when he retired. He just made an announcement. We went through ESPN to have kind of an essay there. But at his last exit interview, you know, he talked about the fact that he wasn't going to jump into something that was going to take him away from his family. Even as a guy who hasn't played a lot, he's still traveled, he's still practiced every day. He's still been very committed to the Thunder, and that does take you away. It takes him away from his daughter. It's taken him away from his girlfriend. I think he wants some time there. So he may not want to jump into anything that's incredibly time-consuming. He may not want to live here. We don't know what his plans are. He left as soon as the offseason was over, so we don't know what he's going to do in that regard. But I think if he wants to be involved with the Thunder, I suspect they're going to find a way to involve him.
You know, Barry, one of the things I think about when I see other guys retire and they want to get into the league, going out and being a scout, because you can set your schedule a little bit, you're traveling a decent amount. But regardless, I have a feeling that Sam Presti is going to work like heck to get Nick Collison on this staff in some form or fashion in the coming years, don't you think?
I do. Nick Collison's a little bit of a strange guy in terms of typical NBA. He's got a lot of interests outside of basketball. And I'm not talking about, you know, shoes and fashion and the things you always music. I mean, he's got a lot of varied interests. There's things outside of Celebrityville that I guess that he would be interested in. So for all we know, he's got a grand plan of something completely separate from basketball. So I agree with Brett. If he whatever he wants with the Thunder, I think he could have. But it wouldn't surprise me if he wants something outside of the Thunder organization and outside the game of basketball.
All right, something we'll obviously be monitoring, but no Nick Collison in a Thunder uniform. It's going to be weird, I have to admit. The other night, the NBA held its draft lottery, which didn't really impact the Thunder at all. They don't have a first-round pick because of trades and different things. They won't pick until well into the second round. But some interesting stuff as it relates to other teams and maybe pieces they might be trying to assemble that could impact the Thunder. Also, potentially where Trey Young could go. But let's talk about pieces for other teams, Brett. Do you see anything in this draft order that, you know, obviously the Lakers are, you know, the team not mentioned thus far in what I've said, but, you know, they didn't get a great pick at all, not high. Is there anything that makes you think that this might impact how things go this offseason for the Thunder?
Well, not particularly. I mean, I think it's interesting that you got teams up at the top that, you know, if the NBA were rigging this thing, you wouldn't have Phoenix and Sacramento and Atlanta at the top of this thing. Phoenix is the one that's obviously at number one the most interesting because they get it's a really intriguing opportunity now for Phoenix because DeAndre Ayton is the guy who is the most logical guy. But they have an interesting tie. The coach they just hired, as everybody has talked about a lot, Coach Luka Doncic overseas. And so the idea that they might go with him instead and leave Ayton for somebody down below. The thing I think is most interesting, Phoenix has a really nice base of young talent. It's a long way away from being a good team, but now it's going to get the number one pick. It gets to add the player it chooses to that. And so guess what? Another team in the West has a chance to get better.
Barry, what about Trey Young? Did you see anything in this NBA draft lottery that gave you a clue of where he might be landing? The Oklahoma standout from Norman, leaving after 1 year from the Sooners?
Yeah, what's interesting is this is a very deep draft, but it's not a deep point guard draft. So you got only 2 or 3 guys that might go in the top 10 or 12 in terms of point guard, and you only got 2 or 3 teams that really need a point guard. Most teams pretty set at point guard. Those teams, Orlando, Cleveland, maybe Chicago, maybe New York, they didn't move up into the top 3, so they're not going to get one of these, you know, 6'10", 6'11" marquee players. So it's more likely than ever that Trey Young, in the middle of that first round, or the middle of the lottery, goes to one of those teams, particularly Orlando. Orlando's going to get to number 6, and they're going to take a point guard. They've got no – DJ Augustine is literally their point guard. So they're going to take a point guard. Is it Colin Sexton of Alabama or is it Trey Young of Oklahoma? That's probably going to be their pick. A lot of people are saying Trey Young now. A lot can happen, but it seems like that a very good chance he could end up in Orlando, Florida, playing for the Magic.
You know, Brett, as you think about the draft, which obviously we'll put a lot more attention to as we get a little bit closer and combine happens and those sorts of things. But the Thunder have these 2 late picks in the second round, 53 where they're slotted, and then 57, a pick that they got from a deal that involved the Celtics. The way this thing shook out, do you see them potentially trying to package, move up, get in the first round? Is that worth trying to make some moves in this draft at all?
It's hard to say because I think this is a really top-heavy draft. You know, last year you had a chance. I think there were some players available in the second round. There were some guys who are playing now. And there's been a lot written in the last couple of weeks about how much the second round has changed, how valuable second-round picks are now. A lot of those guys are making teams. A lot of them are getting guaranteed contracts. There are players to be found in second rounds. I'm not sure that this one will be as good as last year's was. It shouldn't be. But there's a possibility. Could you get a team that doesn't really want players right now that might be willing to give up a higher second-round pick for those lower 2 and maybe look at European stash guys? That might also be something that the Thunder would consider, is taking a guy now and leaving him in Europe for a little while. You know, Nick Collison's retirement is going to open a roster spot. I think Dakari Johnson will probably be back to kind of fill that guy at the end of the bench who's a power forward / center, primarily a center in Dakari's case. I think they'll have that spot taken care of so that they have an extra spot now. Do they want to elevate one of their two-way guys? Would they be looking to maybe move up in the second round and take a guy who could make the team as a rookie? They have a lot of options. You know,
before we get off the draft lottery order, Phoenix, Sacramento, Atlanta, as you mentioned, Brett, if you guys are at the top of the draft, Barry, who you think who are you taking number 1? Who do you like that's out there?
I could give you an answer that would come across as very educated, but let me promise you, I don't have any idea. Luka Doncic, I don't know anything about him. DeAndre Ayton at Arizona, I didn't pay any attention to Arizona. I don't know. I like Bagley from Duke. I think he's probably the number 3 prospect on the list. I don't know. What's interesting to me, though, is this year, the top 4 or 5 guys going down to Michael Porter Jr. even and guys like that are all your big guys. Mohamed Bamba at Texas is another one. They're all in the 6'10", 6'11", 7-foot range for the most part. There's not, the little guys often dominate the early draft list. That's not this year. So I find that very interesting, that people are looking for the tall, rangy power forwards who can also shoot. Some of these guys are centers, Jaren Jackson of Michigan State and that crowd. But to me, it's interesting that this is a deep draft. It's also a tall draft.
Brett, you got any feeling on those top spots?
I would take Ayton first, I think, if I was Phoenix. I understand the appeal of a guy like Doncic for them. He can play a couple different positions. He can play with the ball, and then you've got Devin Booker, and that's a really interesting backcourt. But to me, Ayton is the guy who, if you take Ayton at 1 and that doesn't work out, nobody can blame you. That's the pick that you would be most logical, I think, there. Jaren Jackson, Barry mentioned from Michigan State, is a guy who really fascinates me. I don't think he's a number 1 pick type guy, but I think whoever gets him, that's a real intriguing pick in today's NBA, I think, in terms of just like a long guy who can help you switch, who can protect the rim some, a terrific athlete, he can put the ball on the floor. I like him a whole lot, so that's an interesting guy to me.
All right, lots more, as I mentioned, to come on the draft. We'll continue to hear names pop out. The Thunder, obviously, they don't pretty sequestered when it comes to who they're trying out, but we'll continue to try to ferret those out as well. Lastly, guys, before we get out of here, we're knee-deep in the middle of our Thunder a Day series, which, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, Andre Robertson gracing the cover here earlier this week. But every day, a Thunder player that we write about, we grade. Barry does the report card on them. As we've gone through this series, we're really just kind of getting started. We're only a little bit into this, but have you guys learned anything? Anything popped out as you've rewound on these guys to either write stories or report card? Brett, anything jumped out at you?
The thing that there were a couple things. I did the Paul George one to start off with. I was really intrigued by just kind of looking at Paul George's best games because I wanted to look at how did it work when he and Westbrook played well together. And the thing is, it worked really well. When Paul George scored, the Thunder was really good. He had 11 30-point games, 30 or more points. And they went 10-1 in those games. They had a great record when he scored 25 and Westbrook scored 20, and that shouldn't be surprising. But what it tells you is that when those two guys really clicked, when it really got working, and never more so than Game 5 of that Utah series in the third quarter when they made the 25-point comeback, Steven Adams was setting screens, and those guys were just kind of working. That worked really well, and it's an intriguing thing to look ahead to if Paul George should return. The other thing, just in working on one for Thursday, today's paper, the the Terrence Ferguson one, I didn't realize the discrepancy in terms of, Terrence Ferguson took 149 three-pointers, and he about almost 80% of his shots, I think, were three-point shots, somewhere in that neighborhood. So, he talked about wanting to come back as a different player. And I think that's important. The Thunder's got to find ways to get his athleticism, his ability to put the ball on the floor. They got to get that into the game a little bit and make him more than just a catch-and-shoot three-point shooter. He has the ability to do that, and I think that's an important piece for them, but they need more than just that.
It's always interesting to rewind on these things because you get in the middle of the season and the crush of the games, and you sort of forget to sort of step back and take a look at stuff like that. Barry, anything stood out to you as Thunder a Day has rolled on?
Well, what I found interesting was the analytics on the starting lineup. When Andre Robertson was healthy, not just the record, but just that starting lineup. We've been trashing on Carmelo Anthony since the end of the Thunder run, and there's a lot of issues with Carmelo. But the truth is, that starting lineup, when Andre Robertson was part of it, was really good. Those guys, I think it was over 48 minutes, it was a plus 14 average. So. When Carmelo got to play with Andre Robertson and Paul George and Steven Adams and Russell Westbrook, that starting lineup was one of the best in the NBA. And so, I don't think the Thunder is going to use that to say, hey, Carmelo's great, let's go with what we're doing. But I do think it shows that Carmelo can work in certain situations, and that starting lineup was one of them.
Something somebody suggested to me was that maybe nobody was more hindered by what happened with Andre Robertson than Carmelo Anthony because of the way they were sort of such a complement. Right. Carmelo does so many things offensively that mask what Robertson can't do, and the opposite is true at the defensive end.
That's right.
My favorite part of the Robertson piece was seeing him in exit interviews with the scruff. You lose sight of what these guys look like sometimes, how they alter that. Give us a little preview, Brett, of what we got coming up, because obviously Sundays are kind of our hallmark, either players or front office personnel. What can people expect in the coming days?
Well, yeah, one thing we haven't always done in the Thunder a Day series is really look at guys outside of players, and this weekend we are going to do that and take a look at Billy Donovan and Sam Presti and just kind of evaluate the years that they had. It's interesting, I think, Barry, you mentioned this yesterday. A general manager is a hard person to evaluate in a year because those moves are not based on 1 year. And with Sam Presti in particular, what happens with Paul George is going to be really, it's going to say a lot about what kind of year he had. But I think just kind of looking at the years that those guys had, what they did right and what they could have done better. We always do that with players. I think it's kind of interesting to take a look beyond just the roster in that regard.
Barry, as you think about report cards of these guys coming up, who are you looking forward to? Who are you maybe a little less excited about doing the grades for?
Well, I'm not that excited about DeCurry Johnson because there's just not that much to grade. I mean, he's been in class for like 2 days, and so I'm gonna have to do some excavating to do a full report card on DeCurry Johnson. Somebody like Russell Westbrook, I could give him 100 grades. I mean, there's so much there that just a bottomless pit of information about Russell Westbrook. So that's always fun. I like guys like people like Josh Hustis is interesting because to me he's such an interesting player, and Raymond Felton, the guys that don't play a ton, but they do so many interesting things comparative to what this team needs or hasn't had in the past. So it's always fun. To me, it helps me sort of realize what I just saw. You mentioned it, Jacko, that when you're in the season, it can't always see it. But when you can step back and look at the totality of the year, you learn all kinds of things that you sort of thought you knew, but you weren't really sure about. I enjoy doing these report cards.
You're going to have some time to get that Russell Westbrook report card done up because he finishes the series.
He's last.
He's last. So you got some weeks. We got some time to get that ready. Hope you enjoy Thunder a Day. We'll be around to do more Thunder Thursdays as the off season goes, but be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.